The morning sun painted golden streaks across the busy London street as Captain James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial red coat. 28 years old and proud to serve in the Queen's Guard, he stood tall outside Buckingham Palace. His black bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head, and his polished boots reflected the early light. James had been guarding the palace for 5 years now. Every day brought tourists with cameras, children pointing in wonder, and the occasional person trying to make him smile or move. He had trained himself to remain perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. The other guards often joked that James could stand motionless through a thunderstorm, but today felt different somehow. As James took his position at the palace gates, he noticed the usual crowd gathering. School children pressed their faces against the iron railings. Parents lifted toddlers for better views, and tour guides explained the history of the famous Red Guards. The familiar sounds of the city buzzed around him: car engines, chattering voices, and the distant hum of London life. James came from a military family. His grandfather had served in World War II, and his father had been a police officer for 30 years. From childhood, James knew he wanted to protect and serve people. When he joined the Queen's Guard, his parents beamed with pride. His mother always said he had the kindest heart she had ever known. Though she worried, he kept his emotions hidden behind his serious guard duties. Standing at attention, James watched the world move around him. He saw business people rushing to work, tourists snapping photos, and locals going about their daily routines. Though he could not move or speak while on duty, his sharp green eyes missed nothing. He noticed when children looked scared, when elderly people struggled with heavy bags, and when someone seemed lost or confused. The palace protocol was strict and clear. Guards must remain motionless and silent during their shifts. They represented the crown and the long tradition of British royal protection. Any movement, any break in concentration, could result in serious consequences. James respected these rules deeply and had never once broken protocol in his 5 years of service. As the morning progressed, the street grew busier. Double-decker buses rumbled past, their bright red matching James's uniform. Street performers played music nearby, and the aroma of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. James remained perfectly still, his rifle held at the precise angle required by centuries of tradition. Little did James know that this ordinary Tuesday morning would become extraordinary. In just a few hours, his natural compassion would be put to the ultimate test. The choice he would face would challenge everything he believed about duty, rules, and what it truly meant to serve others. The morning sun continued to climb higher, and James continued his silent watch, unaware that his life was about to change forever. At exactly 11:30 in the morning, James spotted her through the corner of his eye. An elderly woman with silver hair and a worn brown coat was making her way slowly along the sidewalk. She used a wooden walking stick and moved carefully, as if each step required great effort. Her name was Margaret Thompson, though James did not know this yet. Margaret was 83 years old and lived alone in a small flat 6 blocks away from the palace. She had been a teacher for 40 years, before retiring, dedicating her life to helping children learn and grow. Every Tuesday, she made the long journey to visit the palace gardens, which reminded her of happier times when she would bring her late husband Harold to see the changing of the guard. Harold had passed away 2 years ago, and Margaret still felt lost without him. They had been married for 58 years, and he had been her best friend, her companion, and her strength. Now, these weekly walks to the palace were her way of feeling connected to the memories they had shared together. The beautiful gardens and the sight of the disciplined guards gave her comfort during her lonely days. As Margaret approached the busy intersection near the palace, she paused and looked uncertain. The street was filled with fast-moving traffic. Cars, buses, and motorcycles rushed past in both directions. The crossing lights seemed to change too quickly, and the pedestrian signal beeped rapidly, adding to her confusion. Her arthritis made it difficult to move quickly. Her eyesight was not as sharp as it once had been. James watched Margaret from his post, noting her hesitation. She stood at the edge of the crosswalk, gripping her walking stick tightly. Several times she started to step forward, then pulled back as vehicles whizzed by. Other pedestrians hurried past her, too busy to notice her struggle. The morning rush was in full swing. Everyone seemed focused only on reaching their destinations. Margaret checked her old wristwatch and sighed. She had an appointment at the Palace Visitor Center to collect some historical information for her local community group. If she missed this appointment, she would have to wait another month to reschedule. But the traffic seemed endless. She felt increasingly overwhelmed by the noise and speed of the busy intersection. James felt his heart tug as he observed Margaret's predicament. In his 5 years of guard duty, he had witnessed many situations where people needed help. There had been lost children, confused tourists, and individuals who had fallen ill near the palace. Each time, he had been forced to remain at his post, trusting that others would step in to assist. The rules were absolute, and breaking them was unthinkable. But something about Margaret was different. Perhaps it was the way she stood so alone. In the crowd, or the determined yet frightened expression on her face, James could see she was trying to gather courage for something that should have been simple, but had become a mountain to climb. The intersection grew busier, the traffic louder, Margaret smaller and more fragile against the backdrop of the rushing city. Time seemed to slow as James watched this quiet drama unfold before him. His training screamed at him to remain motionless, but his heart whispered something entirely different. Margaret stood at the crosswalk for nearly 10 minutes, watching the endless stream of vehicles. Each time the pedestrian light turned green, she would take a tentative step forward, only to retreat when she realized she could not cross quickly enough. The traffic light seemed designed for people who could move at normal speed, not for someone who needed time and care with each step. A group of teenagers rushed past her, laughing and talking loudly into their phones. A businessman in an expensive suit brushed by without a glance, checking his watch impatiently. Even a mother pushing a stroller hurried past, too focused on her crying baby to notice Margaret's struggle. The world moved around her as if she were invisible. James felt a growing tension in his chest. Every fiber of his being wanted to help this woman, but his duty bound him to his post like invisible chains. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and follow orders without question. Breaking formation during guard duty was not just against regulations, it was unthinkable. Guards who abandoned their posts faced immediate dismissal and permanent disgrace. Margaret tried once more to cross, stepping into the street just as the light began to change. A delivery truck rounded the corner faster than expected, its horn blaring loudly. Margaret froze in the middle of the crosswalk, unable to move forward or backward quickly enough. The truck driver slammed on his brakes, and several other cars honked their horns in frustration. In that split second, James made a decision that would change his life forever. Without thinking about consequences or regulations, he stepped down from his post. His heavy black boots clicked against the pavement as he moved toward Margaret with quick, purposeful strides. The tourists around the palace gasped in surprise and began taking photos and videos. "Ma'am, let me help you," James said gently, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. He offered Margaret his arm, and she looked up at him with eyes filled with both surprise and relief. Her weathered hand trembled slightly as she accepted his support. Together, they crossed the busy street. James moved slowly, matching Margaret's pace perfectly. His tall, strong presence seemed to create a protective bubble around them. Cars waited patiently, their drivers watching this unexpected scene unfold. The truck driver who had nearly caused the accident rolled down his window and gave James a respectful nod. When they reached the other side safely, Margaret looked up at James with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, young man," she whispered. "I have not felt so safe crossing a street in years. You are very kind." James smiled warmly, forgetting for a moment that dozens of people were watching and filming. "It was my pleasure, ma'am. Are you all right? Do you need any other assistance?" Margaret patted his arm gently. "I am perfectly fine now, thanks to you. But should you not be at your post? I would hate for you to get in trouble because of me." The reality of what he had done suddenly hit James like a cold wave. He looked back at his empty post, at the gathering crowd, at the cameras pointing in his direction. He had broken one of the most sacred rules of his position. There would certainly be consequences. James walked Margaret to a nearby bench and made sure she was comfortable before returning to his post. The crowd that had gathered was larger now, with people pointing and whispering excitedly. Several tourists approached him with thumbs up and words of praise, but James had already returned to his statue-like stance, staring straight ahead with professional discipline. Within minutes, videos of James helping Margaret began appearing on social media. A young woman named Sarah Chen had captured the entire scene on her phone while visiting London with her family. She posted the video on several platforms with the caption, "This royal guard broke protocol to help an elderly lady cross the street. Faith in humanity restored." The video spread like wildfire across the internet. People shared it thousands of times within the first hour. Comments poured in from around the world, praising James for his kindness and humanity. Many viewers noted how gentle and patient he had been with Margaret, and how he had risked his career to do the right thing. Meanwhile, back at the palace, James's commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, had already received reports about the incident. Security cameras had captured everything, and palace officials were debating how to respond. Breaking formation during guard duty was a serious offense that typically resulted in immediate disciplinary action. Colonel Harrison was a stern but fair man who had served in the military for 30 years. He had seen many young guards struggle with the balance between following orders and following their hearts. As he reviewed the footage of James helping Margaret, he found himself in an unexpected position. The act was clearly against regulations, but it was also undeniably the right thing to do. By afternoon, news reporters had arrived at the palace gates. They interviewed tourists who had witnessed the event, and everyone had positive things to say about James's actions. Margaret herself had returned to speak with reporters, bringing along old photographs of her late husband in his military uniform. "That young guard reminded me so much of my Harold," Margaret told the BBC reporter. "He served his country with honor, but he never forgot that rules exist to protect people, not to stop us from helping each other. What this guard did today was not just following his training, it was following his heart." The story appeared on evening news programs across Britain and beyond. Social media platforms were flooded with supportive messages for James. People shared their own stories of times when someone had helped them when they needed it most. Hashtag Compassionate Guard began trending worldwide. As James finished his shift that evening, he was called to meet with Colonel Harrison. Walking through the palace corridors, James prepared himself for the worst. He knew he would likely face suspension, demotion, or even dismissal. But as he thought about Margaret's grateful smile and the relief in her eyes, he realized he would make the same choice again, without hesitation. The meeting would determine not just James's future with the Queen's Guard, but also send a message about what kind of values the institution truly held. As James knocked on the colonel's office door, he stood tall and proud, ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. Colonel Harrison sat behind his mahogany desk, studying the reports spread before him. When James entered and saluted smartly, the colonel gestured for him to sit down. The office was quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. "Captain Mitchell," the colonel began, his voice serious but not harsh. "I suppose you know why you are here." James nodded. "Yes, sir. I broke formation during guard duty to assist a civilian. I accept full responsibility for my actions and am prepared to face the consequences." The colonel leaned back in his chair, observing James carefully. "Tell me, Captain, what were you thinking when you left your post?" James considered the question honestly. "Sir, I saw an elderly woman in danger, and I knew she needed help. I understand that I violated protocol, but I could not stand by and watch her potentially get hurt when I had the ability to prevent it. And you realize this could end your career with the Guard?" "Yes, sir, I understand that completely." Colonel Harrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace courtyard. "Captain Mitchell, in my 30 years of military service, I have learned that there are times when following orders blindly is not the same as serving with honor. What you did today was not in the manual, but it was undoubtedly right." James looked up, surprised by the colonel's words. The colonel continued, "However, we cannot simply ignore protocol whenever we feel like it. The structure and discipline of the Guard exist for important reasons. So here is what we are going to do. He turned to face James directly. You will receive an official reprimand for leaving your post. This will remain in your file. James nodded, accepting this consequence. But, the colonel continued, you will also receive a commendation for exceptional service and displaying the highest values of British military tradition, your actions. Today reminded us all why we serve, not just to follow rules, but to protect and care for the people of this nation. The next morning, newspapers across Britain featured James's story on their front pages. The Daily Mail ran the headline hero, Guard's Heart of Gold, while The Guardian wrote When Humanity Trumps Protocol. International news outlets picked up the story, and James found himself famous around the world. Margaret Thompson had become something of a celebrity herself. Reporters discovered that she had volunteered at local charities for decades, helping other elderly people in her community. She had never asked for recognition, simply believing that helping others was what decent people did. Now at 83, she found herself on television talking about kindness and community. I have lived through many changes in this world, Margaret told a journalist. But what never changes is the power of simple human kindness. That young guard reminded me that there are still people who will choose to do right, even when it costs them something. Letters and gifts began arriving at the palace addressed to James. Children sent him drawings.
Elderly people
wrote heartfelt thank you notes. And people from around the world shared stories of times when strangers had helped them. James was overwhelmed by the response and humbled by the impact of what he had considered a simple act of decency. 3 weeks after the incident, James received an unexpected invitation. The royal family had requested to meet with him privately. He was escorted through parts of the palace he had never seen before, past magnificent paintings and rooms filled with centuries of history. When he entered the elegant drawing room, he was greeted warmly and told that his actions had been noted at the highest levels. What you did represents the very best of British values, he was told. Compassion, courage, and putting others before yourself. These are the qualities we hope to see in all who serve the crown. James was informed that a new initiative would be launched, inspired by his actions. The Community Guardian Program would train selected guards in basic first aid and allow them greater flexibility to assist people in genuine emergencies. The rigid protocols would remain for security purposes, but there would now be official guidelines for when guards could provide humanitarian assistance. Margaret Thompson was also invited to the palace that day. When she met James again, they embraced like old friends. She had brought him a homemade scarf she had knitted, the same shade of red as his guard uniform. I wanted to make you something to keep you warm during those long hours of standing, she said with a bright smile. The friendship that developed between J.S. and Margaret became another beautiful part of their story. He began visiting her on his days off, helping with grocery shopping and small repairs around her flat. She would tell him stories about her teaching days and show him old photographs of her travels with Harold. In many ways, they filled empty spaces in each other's lives. James's fellow guards initially teased him about becoming famous, but they soon expressed genuine admiration for his courage. Many admitted they had faced similar moments where they wanted to help someone but felt bound by regulations. James's example had shown them that sometimes the most important duty was to serve humanity itself. The story continued to inspire people months later. Schools began using it as an example of moral courage in their character education programs. Community groups shared it as a reminder that small acts of kindness could change lives. Even other military and police organizations around the world discussed how to balance strict protocols with compassionate service. James returned to his regular duties, but with a new understanding of what it meant to be a true guardian. He realized that protecting people was not just about standing at attention or following orders perfectly. Sometimes it meant having the courage to step forward when someone needed help, even when it felt scary or uncertain. Margaret continued her weekly visits to the palace, but now she crossed the street with confidence, knowing that there were people watching out for her safety. She also began volunteering to help other elderly people in her neighborhood, inspired by the kindness she had received. 1 year later, James was promoted to sergeant and was chosen to train new guards. He always told them Margaret's story and reminded them that their greatest duty was not to the rules in a book, but to the people they had sworn to protect. He taught them that true strength sometimes meant knowing when to bend, and that the highest form of service was service to humanity itself. The intersection where James first helped Margaret was eventually renamed Compassion Crossing by the local council. A small plaque was installed there, reading simply, "Where kindness meets courage, ordinary moments become extraordinary." Margaret and James attended the dedication ceremony together, smiling as children and elderly people crossed. Safely, watched over by guards who now understood that their most important duty was to care for others.